grantees. Today, we're here for the Voluntary Services for Housing Providers webinar with presenters Karen Romero and Shikari Dominique. And we are so excited to be here with you for today's topic. And with that, I will turn it over to the lovely presenters, and I will continue to put information in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to message me directly.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. We are really looking forward to having a conversation with you all. As you can see, we are a smaller group, and this is very intentional. We want to dive into the conversation around voluntary services for housing providers, which really will be grounded in your work as an OVC housing provider. We want to make sure that we have space and that we create space for you all to ask questions. You have the chat box, you'll see that Q&A box at the bottom. And so we'll try to look at those, but definitely our colleagues who are on the call, they're going to be helping us put those together. So if we don't answer them throughout the webinar, we'll definitely have some time at the very end for Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, please feel free to share them. Also, we recognize that many of you have been doing housing work for a very long time and have experience and expertise in this area, and we want to cross-share ideas and solutions. And so please feel free and encouraged to bring that in. We want to hear what your experience has been throughout this webinar. So we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide, and we're going to start with a land acknowledgement for Freedom Network. Although we are all over the country, we do have an office in DC, and in DC, that is the land of the Nacotchtank and Pickastawe people. And so we want to acknowledge that land and allowing us to bring this webinar and being able to sit on those native and tribal lands. For me, I'm joining you all from Salt Lake City, Utah. That's the land of the Ute, Paiute, and Goshu. And so for you, you can learn more about what lands you reside on by going to native-land.ca and getting that information for your own area. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. And we just want to spend some brief time sharing a little bit about ourselves. Like Em had shared at the beginning, if you will send on the chat box, if you can add your name, what organization you're joining us from, and what region you're joining. So, city, state, it'll help to get to know kind of who's with us today during our call. And it'll also help your fellow participants get a sense of where in the country we all are. So I would love to share a little bit more about our program in this technical assistance project and also about Freedom Network. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'll do that briefly. So Freedom Network is a national coalition. We advance the response of human trafficking through a human rights-based approach. So that basically looks that we're looking at the root causes, we're addressing and acknowledging root causes that continue to fuel human trafficking in the US, and that we acknowledge and really try to address the intersections and work at those intersections. We know that things like racism, homophobia, a lot of the isms, poverty will continue to fuel human trafficking, and we cannot have an approach that does not address those pieces. So as housing providers and those that are doing work with survivors, specifically around housing, you all are probably very cognizant of that need and that intersection and how critical it is for everyone to have access to housing as a human right. The Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project, we've been around for 6 years now, and some of the things that we provide to OVC grantees, such as yourselves, is doing training and technical assistance. And I'll give some examples because sometimes that just feels so abstract. But basically what that means is we provide webinars such as this one, where we really dive deep into some of the conversations, some of the models, some of the intersections of housing and human trafficking to really support learning for OVC grantees and others that have that work at the intersection. We do one-on-one technical assistance, which might mean that you're struggling or working through, policy and procedure or a very specific housing concept or a relationship and partnership. We can provide some support and some brainstorming through that because we know that sometimes especially around housing, things can feel very complicated and it can weigh us down. And it's nice to be able to have a colleague, which we hope we can be to you all, who can support that work. Peer learning communities provides that with your peers throughout the US. So like many of the people on this call, a lot of y'all are doing housing either more new, it might be newer to your role or to your organization, or you may have been doing this work for a long time. And this is where we want to make sure that we have the opportunity and that we create that space for us to cross share ideas, because whatever's happening on one coast versus another, you're likely experiencing very similar challenges and may be able to learn and really benefit from some of those opportunities and those ideas that your peers might have. So we provide those as well as working through housing policies and procedures. So we'll be talking more about that because that's very much centered around voluntary services. So we'll go to the next slide where I'll introduce a little bit of our team. So this is the housing project team. My name is Karen Romero, as I had mentioned. I am the Senior Director of Training, so I lead our training institute and have been at Freedom Network for 6 years. Prior to that, I did direct services. So I think that's one of the areas that I like to highlight and pull some of my own experiences, because housing can be challenging. Housing survivors can be challenging, and I mean that in managing a project or working on the day to day. I've worked at a shelter, and I remember, and that was a 24-hour shelter, and I remember some of the challenges and some of the decisions that I made or that we made as a team, many times out of fear, or we wanted to ensure safety. And so I'll definitely highlight and share some of the experiences that I've, learned from. And now in retrospect, wishing like, oh, okay, I wish I had known that before or gone back. But that's where a lot of my work was prior to Freedom Network. So I worked in direct services, including domestic violence shelter. I provided individual therapy at a rape crisis center, and I oversaw social services program that served survivors of human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, and unaccompanied minors. And I've provided services both in English and in Spanish. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm coming from. You'll also see here on our slide, we have our Abigail, who's our coordinator, Tatiana, who's our associate manager, Jean, who's our executive director, and then Shikari, who's going to be also co-facilitating with me. So I'll go ahead and send it over to Shikari, and she can introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to have y'all with us today. My name is Shakari Dominique. My pronouns are she, her. I am a training specialist here at Freedom Network. So some of those things Karen mentioned, I help and assist with, like providing training and technical assistance, like facilitating these webinars, and also being a part of that process when you are going through that policy and procedure review process. So, like I said, my pronouns are she, her. I'm originally from Louisiana, and I'm currently located in DC right now. It's been a fun move, a fun time. I got my start in the anti-trafficking field working with a grassroots organization in Louisiana that serves trafficking survivors. And then I will kick us off. Next slide. So right now we're going to jump into some objectives for this conversation today. So this is going to be a conversation about voluntary services approach. So we're going to provide some foundational understanding of the history and benefits of it. We're going to share some tools for aligning your OVC funded housing program policies and procedures with this model. Today, you'll be able to identify potential areas of your OVC funded housing program to implement a voluntary service model. And we'll review and discuss some frequently asked questions that we get here on the housing project around the voluntary services model. Next slide. So, of course, we're going to kick off everything with a poll. We're going to launch this poll now, and I'm going to read it out loud. So we just want to gauge your knowledge of voluntary services model. So how knowledgeable are you of the voluntary services model? A, this is my first time hearing of this approach. B, I have heard of this approach but have not yet implemented this approach. Or C, I have heard of this approach and I am actively implementing this approach within our programs. So take a couple of minutes here and um, let us know how knowledgeable you are of this. And from the results I'm looking in, quite a bit of you have heard of this and are actively implementing this. So this should be a really good conversation here. And we do have half the people here are saying this is their first time hearing of this. So this is going to be really good and beneficial. Right around 11% that says I've heard of this approach but have not yet implemented it. So we're going to talk about ways in which you can implement that as well here today. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to jump right into things. But before we delve into the deep topic of it, I do want to give out a little reminder. It's important to remember that most programs come to this model, voluntary service model, for different reasons. Right now, you see we have our little memes where the guy is sweating, trying to decide which one to choose. Sometimes you may have a resistance or aversions to change, and sometimes implementing change can be difficult. But as we engage in this conversation today, we want to remind you that change is not only difficult, but it can be done. Like this is probably won't be the hardest thing you've ever done today. So it's normal to feel resistant in changing things. It is especially challenging in an environment which clients are in crisis and experiencing traumatic stress. Um, it's not the voluntary service model is not all or nothing. So we don't have to do everything right now. There may be tension points you feel between your funders and state requirements and et cetera. But we want to acknowledge upfront that we can get past those tension in this conversation. Voluntary service can exist on a spectrum, and we can see where we can start at. But I also would like to remind you all that for OBC grantees, that this is a mandatory training, and you are able to note your attendance on the TTA checklist as well. So next slide. Okay, so we're going to start off with some key terms. So right here, you see we have voluntary services, trauma-informed care, survivor-centered, and we have harm reduction. So the voluntary service models is based on the idea that participating in services should be voluntary and not conditioned around receiving shelter or other housing services. So that's the foundation for it. Trauma-informed approach recognizes that the signs of trauma in staff and clients and others, and by responding by integrating that knowledge into our policies, procedures, and practices. Trauma-informed approaches places priority on restoring the survivor's feeling of safety, choice, and control. So at the root of it, voluntary services is a trauma-informed care approach. So when we talk about survivor-centered, we're talking about placing those survivors' priorities, needs, and interests at the center of our work. So providing non-judgmental assistance with the emphasis on client self-determination and assisting them to feel safety and security, and knowing that they can make the best decisions for themselves as well. Sometimes as um, service providers, we may kind of think we know best, so we may think we have the plan down. But we want to also put that um, empower survivors to know that they know what's best for themselves as well. So that's what we kind of talk about when we talk about survivor-centered approach. So when we're talking about harm reduction, this is a philosophy that guides policies, programs, and practice to aim them to minimize the negative health, social, and legal impacts of a particular actions. We see a lot of harm reduction talk and vocabulary around drug use or substance use, but we can incorporate that around a lot of other things like eating disorders, engaging in sex work. We can incorporate those things. So harm reduction is something that you'll see utilized in the voluntary services approach as well. Harm reduction focuses on making positive changes and working with people without judgment, coercion, and discrimination, and working with people to engage more positive behaviors. Next slide. So here we have the history of voluntary services. So kind of sort of around early 2000s, we see programs individually evaluating their use of rules. Historically, OVC has emphasized a victim-centered and trauma-informed care for service provisions. So around 2020, OVC started adding in their housing solicitations to include the use of the voluntary service model approach. Next slide. So I'm going to toss it back over to you,
Yeah, that's
Carrie.
gonna be me. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shakari. Awesome. So one of the things, as we have this conversation is I want to acknowledge for us, especially for you all as direct service providers, you're doing the work day in and day out. And so some of these concepts can feel very theoretical or they can feel very nice and ideal, but it can feel difficult to really put them into practice when it comes on the day-to-day running a housing program and ensuring that clients from diverse backgrounds, from diverse needs have access to services. And also one of the things, and I'll make sure we address this, is around safety. We hear this, I hear this all the time. And I remember back in direct services, a lot of the times when we made any one decision, when we implemented any rule, was to ensure safety, and that's the way we would word it. And oftentimes it would be to like prevent, we thought we were preventing something from happening again, right? So if somebody was not checking in and they hadn't checked in for a night, then we would implement a rule, and we did, back in the day, that if you didn't check in with your case manager in the next 24 hours, then you could be exited from shelter. Or if you took any pictures in a specific area, then that could be an exit. I mean, we were basically creating a significant amount of rules out of concern, out of fear, to be quite frankly, and also out of just not knowing a different way because we assumed that the more rules we had, the more safe that program and the clients and we staff would be, which was not actually true. Like that did not have the intended consequence. It had unintended consequences, but it didn't actually happen the way that we wanted or intended to. So one of the things that I like to discuss when we're talking about rules and specifically when we're talking about voluntary services, like Shakari had mentioned, it is allowing the survivor to have housing and then to engage and select what services, in addition to housing, feel the most useful and beneficial to them. So it is not using housing as the reward or the carrot for somebody being compliant or ensuring that they're, meeting all of the goals that the program has set rather than what they've set themselves. With housing programs, there really is a unique setting, whereas the service provider, we're the ones providing that very critical need. It's often the most immediate need when they're exiting a trafficking situation, which is housing. We hear this in reports all the time. Anytime, we see a report from survivor-led organizations or the council, the TIP report, we see housing come up time and time again. The need for housing, the need to access low barrier housing, more housing, longer term housing is always coming up. So as housing providers, whether you're providing shelter or transitional housing or rental assistance, it is really important to acknowledge that you have a critical resource that this group that, of survivors, this community that we're trying to serve needs, and that just creates a power dynamic, right? So we can say that, we can acknowledge that, because that allows us to look at the unintended consequences that our systems, that our own programs can have on survivors, especially when we may be replicating power dynamics that they just came out of or that they've already experienced through a trafficking situation. So think about, for example, some of the programs that you've worked at. It could be your current program, it can be a previous program. Are there any rules that felt, even if it was at the time, this is a judgment-free zone, are there any rules or any restrictions that you all saw being implemented that now you're curious on, or you have moved away from as a result because it felt like it was not allowing survivor autonomy? So if you want to put those in the chat, just any sort of rule, especially with housing. So in order to be part of that housing program, were there any rules, any restrictions that you all, that you've seen implemented in housing programs? whether it's, a partner program that you all work with, if it's a previous program that you've worked with in the past, or something that you're currently seeing. And so if you want to throw those in the chat, because these are not going to be unique to any one program or location. We know that a lot of programs throughout the US have, these rules, they have restrictions. And I'll start us off. Obtaining employment, thank you. Taking cell phones away, yes. Yes. And don't worry, we won't assume that you are the program doing it. You can just throw out some examples. So the request or the requirement to obtain employment, and it's usually the way that I've seen it is under within a specific time frame, right? Because that can tell us, and I'm saying this not sarcastically, sometimes we think it can tell us that somebody's really motivated to get housing and to be able to thrive longer term. And then also taking cell phones away. And that is a very, very common one that we often see because oftentimes, again, we use that in the name of safety, or we think that that's going to keep the survivors safer if they don't have access. Finding substances, yep, or being exited from a shelter or program because you found some sort of substance requiring employment or school involvement. Yep, locking toiletries up, cleaning supplies, etc. Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for whoever just put the requirement to attend group classes for at least 3 times a day a week while in program. So if you start adding these up, many programs have significant numbers of these. Sometimes a lot of these are just within one program. So if you start taking a lot of these and putting them into an experience, think about if you would be, as a person, as your own individual self, interested or would feel empowered being in that type of program for yourself, right? I would assume most of us would not. It would not feel very welcoming or empowering. I saw some additional notes in there about programs that don't support parents with their children. I know that I believe is actually one of the programs that I worked with. We didn't accept male children over the age of, I think it was like 14, which that is not trauma informed, right? No tolerance for recruiting behavior, monitors. So, just think about what type of setting, right, somebody's experiencing when they have this many restrictions, rules, expectations. And many of these expectations lead to them either keeping housing or being exited from housing, right? And that's really where we want to highlight the unintended consequences, because these are often not, I don't believe that any of these rules or any of these approaches to housing have ever been made in a desire to make a survivor feel unwelcome or feel like they are not valued. It is often, and we hear this all the time, out of safety concerns. We want to make sure that the survivor is safe and that the rest of the clients are safe. And that makes a lot of sense. Also, as a service provider, we cannot guarantee complete safety for anyone, for any one client, for anyone. And that's just a lot of weight to carry, to feel responsible for, being the one to be solely responsible for ensuring their safety. We want to make them safer, and that may mean what the definition of safety means for that individual. So when we have these rules and things that we think are going to make someone safer, often we can inhibit and prevent somebody's access to natural support systems. So think about a phone and how important it is to you, how it is oftentimes like your connection point to your support system, friends, family, etc., the outside world sometimes. And by not having that, sometimes we're taking someone's connection to their support system away because we assume that that's what they need, even though they're not telling us that that's what they need, right? A lot of this work that goes into having this rule-based system oftentimes creates a program in an environment where the survivor, and I've experienced this firsthand, where a survivor is waiting for me to tell them, or waiting for us as service providers to tell them what's their checklist, what do they need to do in order to access shelter, keep shelter, and then what do they need to do in order to get the next phase of housing, right? So it feels very much like they're asking and waiting on us to give them the checklist to make sure that that's what we're, it sounds sometimes like that's what we're centering, that it's that adherence to rules versus what is important to this client, what do they need, which is clearly housing, and how can we support them in maintaining and accessing longer term housing as well. And think about the trauma, right? The trauma that people have experienced out of definitely their trafficking experience, but also for those that have experienced homelessness or have had housing instability, that's traumatic in itself. And a lot of these dynamics, that are being recreated here in a trafficking situation, many individuals are kept away from loved ones, both through physically, but also through communication. And if we're requiring people to take away and keep away their cell phones, or we're taking them away, we're doing that in a very similar manner. If we're requiring people to have a job by a specific time and deadline, or enter a education program by a specific deadline, we're making these like very power and control dynamics that we may not be the intention, but the outcome and the impact is something that we need to also acknowledge. And thinking about how much people are disclosing too, right? Thinking about our intakes and how we're asking questions. One thing that we want to that I've seen happen in programs is like, we want to make sure you really need housing. If someone's asking for housing, they really need housing, right? And that should be sufficient, along with knowing that that they're a survivor of human trafficking. And we don't need to know details, but we just need to know, does this fit, the description or the eligibility. And those are the things you need to know. Eligibility for under, if specifically if you're working with survivors of human trafficking, and do they need housing? And often if they're already at your program, both of them mean yes. So now that we've talked through the potential outcomes or the potential consequences about having a rule-based and rule-focused program, let's go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit more about the components, about what it actually looks like to do voluntary services. So you'll see in this graphic that in the center, it is survivor-centered, which we use a lot, I feel like, these days. But basically what survivor-centered means is our services are focused on the individual needs of each survivor. So if a survivor is telling us, my first priority is housing, let's get them housed. If they're saying my first priority is getting connected to legal services, let's hear that. Maybe the job hunt is not immediate need for them, but if we're the program and we're the ones requesting and enforcing it, it is not allowing them to really meet the needs that they're identifying. There will be time when people might be interested in all of the great programming that you have available. And also that today may not be the time, right? It might be that they're interested a week from now, a month from now, or 3 months from now. I think somebody had mentioned about having programs 3 weeks or 3 days a week, which that's a lot, for any one person. But maybe that's a program that somebody would be interested on down the road, and it may be a little early for somebody that's just exiting a trafficking situation. So it's kind of taking that approach of one size does not fit everyone, and allowing a more customizable approach that the survivor's leading. The housing, and I'm going to go to the top. So the housing first approach, this has become a lot more common, especially around housing and homelessness systems, where they've been doing work, or obviously around housing for a long time, and has been more recently, and recent as in like years, not months. So it's been a more recently introduced into domestic violence and human trafficking programs, where basically housing first means just that. We house people first. We don't wait for them to be ready, right? Because we can't and we shouldn't be the ones determining when someone's ready for housing. Everyone should have access to housing that's safe and stable. And that means housing is a right. So if we start thinking about housing as a human right, that allows us to take away the barriers that our program might be putting on, which can be screening. So do we have a lengthy screening tool? Do we require program or participants to give us verification of any sort of victimization, to have it be recent, to have it be something that I remember when I worked in a shelter because we just had to work. I don't know that we had to, but we did. We did work out of prioritizing our limited bed space. We often said like this is kind of how it was. It was like who needs it the most, which that's a very terrible place to be in. And so what we ended up doing was ensuring that we had sufficient partners across the region and across the city and the state to make sure that nobody was left out because and that staff wasn't made to left that decision of who needed something the most and that we were housing people because they just needed that. They needed housing. The other components that you'll see is advocating for survivors and for them to be able to access services that they need. It may include legal services or long-term housing or employment services or education services. I remember one of our partners in a program out of New York, they mentioned that they had a client who showed up and they clearly needed like a number of wraparound programs, but one of them that they felt like they should need was access to medical care. And that survivor was very, very focused on obtaining a connection to legal services. And that was very important to them. And that's what they wanted to focus on. And for this service provider, what they said, they're like, I didn't understand why this seems so important to them when like clearly they need medical attention now. And it wasn't until we were able to get them a legal services referral that then this person felt like, okay, now I can be able to meet or like access these other services that they definitely needed, but it just wasn't a priority to them. So just by meeting those needs, it allows that space for the survivor to identify what the next piece of it might be. Acknowledging that services should not be conditional on a survivor meeting the rules that we've established. There are parameters, right? So it's not a free for all. I think sometimes people get worried that with a voluntary services approach, it means everyone can do whatever they want. In the end, there does need to be parameters, of course. It's also opening up those parameters and really assessing what is truly needed for us to provide housing services for survivors in a way that empowers them, in the way that it doesn't minimize their autonomy or take away their autonomy, and in a way that provides them trust in our organization and with our staff, and that we can also give that trust to them, because a lot of it is that, if we really get down to it, the reason why we sometimes put these rules in place is because we don't trust that a survivor might be able to keep themselves safe, even though they can, and they've been able to do that without our services. And we just happen to have the opportunity where we can support them and influence, their access to different organizations or referrals. And the next component, I'll just finish these up, is that these services are individualized, and acknowledging that we do have a power dynamic that is sometimes most often over the survivor, and that in order to acknowledge it, we need to look at it, we need to address it, we need to acknowledge it, and we need to minimize it. And we need to find ways to level out that power dynamic. And finally, ensuring that we're getting survivor feedback, not just at the exit point, but throughout services, that they have the ability to provide both direct and anonymous feedback to our program, to ensure that we're real time providing a follow-up and also meeting what their needs might be. Let's go to the next slide. So I'll just go over this very briefly. We can drop the link on the chat for this study, but basically there was a study that was created, and basically it explored how low barrier and voluntary services and how those policies specifically that were implemented supported staff practices and survivor empowerment. And so what low barrier policies, it required the program to remove barriers that prevented survivors, specifically those that have mental health concerns and or addictions, from being able to access services. And those two populations are often the ones that are screened out because they're the ones that sometimes we feel like that's not within our scope or that's beyond our capacity. And so what this study looked at is, can a low barrier and voluntary services approach take away and remove those barriers? So with the voluntary services, it states that survivors have the right to choose what services, if any, that they want to engage with during their stay at the program. and it allows the survivor's ability to stay at the housing program that's not contingent on the participation of additional program services. So the study looked at two overarching policies within a domestic violence organization. And I will highlight that although it was a domestic violence organization, they did serve survivors of interpersonal violence, sexual assault, torture, and sex trafficking. And so it's obviously very relevant for what we're finding here. But what they started with is when they started implementing low barrier policies is if they looked at the agency ensuring that the survivors were first not screened out, especially for severe mental illness, substance use concerns, how long ago the abuse occurred. So oftentimes many programs prioritize or have almost a cap of making sure that the abuse or the experience happened within a certain amount of time. It needs to be more relevant, if you will, or family size. We've seen that too, where certain family sizes will not be accommodated in certain programs. And they also the survivors in this program didn't have to provide proof of abuse or citizenship. So in addition to that, that was just like the screening. The survivors could choose what services that they wanted to engage in while they were in programs. And what they found was that the services that they were receiving, staff members were really developing to or working to develop trust. They were able to sustain their relationships that centered survivors a lot more. And they just felt like they were able to have just better engagement all around with survivors. And that was very evident in how the staff was able to describe implementing this, this new policy of voluntary services. With on the flip side, with the survivors, they also had very positive feedback from experiencing a program that included them trusting the program, them feeling trusted themselves and empowered, being able to have the ability to have autonomy. So it really was a win-win for everyone. And what, really what came out of it is that this type of model allows for survivors to rebuild their independence, especially after they are coming out of a situation that is, one of the central pieces of trafficking is that it's taking away somebody's autonomy, and this helped restore it. So it was really fantastic to see how that support happened, and also that survivors were able to really feel like they were the ones centered at each goal and having that personalized support. We can go to the next one, which is also a secondary study. The next slide, please, which is a secondary study. Again, very, very similar findings. Basically, what it's telling us is that the work that can happen and the outcomes that can happen around the voluntary services approach is that it does allow for survivors to perceive, to obtain that empathetic and non-judgmental listening and support, like Shikari had mentioned, in that they feel their needs truly be prioritized because the program is no longer focusing on meeting, this list or this work plan, if you will, for the survivor, but it is switching it and identifying what it is that the survivor needs immediately, what are their priorities, how can we ensure that they're housed safely, how do we ensure and start looking at longer term plans for their housing, and how do we work with each other to restore and support them restoring that sense of autonomy and independence that they should have. And oftentimes our programs do not we want to contribute, but sometimes our programs do not. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so here are some questions, to think through as you're looking at this model. So one is, how can we support a survivor in achieving their vision? Their vision is, what are your goals? What would you like to accomplish? What are some of the things that our program can support you in? Is it family reunification? Is it getting a long-term housing program, which you as a program may have the connection for? It might be through your continuum of care or your public housing authority or other resources within the community that aren't solely being provided by your organization. Is it that they want to enter the job market? Is it that they want to have job training, right? And this is a really critical place for you as an organization to share what you can provide. So if somebody is saying, I want to be able to purchase a car, it sounds like transportation might be a need. What within that scope of services can your program be able to support? Because that's also part of just being transparent and clear and providing information for the survivor to be able to utilize is what can your program support them with and what might be a referral. And thinking about how do we center survivors in offering services? So is there a ongoing need or a theme that keeps popping up in programs? One thing that I learned in working in direct services, we had a significant Spanish speaking population. A lot of them were from Mexico and Latin America. And a lot of them, what we were seeing is that they had not finished their schooling back in their home country. And while we were trying to set them up with like a GED, there was like a significant gap. They weren't even there yet because there was still things that they needed to finish up with like their elementary and their secondary education services for them to even get there. So one of the things that we did is that we partnered up with the Mexican consulate who offers a program to finish up the elementary school and also their secondary school, which in Spanish is called secondary school, but it basically means like what high school would be here. And then that allowed and facilitated survivors in accessing then programs either for like technical school, pursuing a GED or pursuing college education if that's what they were interested in. But at a minimum, it allowed them to get that and finish that education that they never got to in their home country. So that was, understanding and hearing from survivors what some of the things that they needed, and then we brought them in house. For housing services, is that the only thing that the survivor needs at that time? And if it is, that's okay. Sometimes we feel like if the survivor is going to come here, like let's give them all of the programs and services that we provide. And sometimes it's just housing that they can tackle at this time, and that is okay, or that they choose to have as a priority, and that's all right. And then thinking about how our services are encouraging autonomy and empowerment and allowing them where they have choice, give them that choice. And also communicate, when there are parameters or boundaries or things that, you as a program may not be able to provide. It's very important to be clear about those. And finally, thinking about how your currently policy and practice model impacts survivors, right? So if you're seeing, let's just say you have a curfew, it's a 10 p.m. curfew or 9, are you seeing a lot of people, a lot of survivors having a difficult time with that? Because that's probably feedback for us that that's not working, it's not a need, and it might be more something that we perceive to be supporting the survivors, which may not be the case at all, right? So it's thinking about how some of the policies and practices that we have in place, really looking back and saying, is this helping us? What was the intention with this? And is it meeting that intention? And even if we think it's meeting the intention of keeping the program, running or safe, is it meeting the intention of serving survivors in a trauma-informed way? All right, we can go on to the next one. And then that's going to go back to Shakari.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. So now we're going to see what it could look like to evaluate our policies and practices. So I encourage you to jot down any ideas that come to mind, because that can be a start. But you think about some of the things that Karen mentioned about curfews and taking away cell phones. And we can just walk through this roadmap when we are looking to evaluate policies and practices. So first we would start with, whatever that practice is, whether it be curfews, whether it be we've heard people call it like a blackout period to take away cell phones and communications with outside entities and things like that. So we could just pick a practice that we want to review. Next is, why do we have this in place? So what made us put this in place? Sometimes I've seen programs there's been this one instance that happened, so therefore they erect a full policy and practices around that. Like it was one incident that happened and now they want to control or not make it happen again. So sometimes we move out of fear when we put things in place. So here we just want to ask ourselves, why do we have this in place? If it's cell phones, why are we taking away cell phones, which could keep them in contact with their support systems? If it's curfews, why do we want them in the house? Why do we want them to return to the residence at that time? It could be 9 p.m., sometimes it's 11 p.m. Whatever those things are, we ask ourselves, why do we have those in place? Next, you could go about asking yourself, who is involved in this development? Um, I know we talk about having survivors involved in planning and providing feedback, but who was involved in the development of these policies and procedures? Were they developed before you arrived here? Were they developed by previous predecessors and things? Who's all been involved in this? Another question we can ask ourselves is, does it align with our values? So based on your organization's values, whether that be a human rights approach, based on your values, how is this policy and practice aligning with your values? It's if you are human rights, and you're trying to go from a human rights approach, are we respecting people's rights to choose? Are we respecting their autonomy and things like that? Next we have, how does it harm survivors? So that's something to see. Like, we can sit down and evaluate, is this harming survivors? Is this doing more bad than it is more good? That's something to think about. How is it helping? Is another question we can ask at this stage. How has it helped? Have survivors come to us and told us that this policy or practice that we are utilizing has been beneficial to them? Or have they come to us and said, I don't like this, or have they been resistant to adapt to some policy and practices we have in place? Next, what are those mechanisms to evaluate the impact? So how are we, again, talking to survivors? How often are we evaluating these policies and practices and seeing how well they're working or if they're not working? That may be something to build in, to look at and to review and evaluate once a year, twice a year, and see how we can make adjustments to things that we have in place. Next, which is a big question, does our funder require it? Is this a legal mandate? I know some people may work with youth, those under minors, those under the age of 18 or 17 in some states. Knowing what your funder is requiring, knowing what legal mandates you have to follow is another way of looking to evaluate your policies and practices as well. Having this information um, beforehand can be beneficial. And also, it's beneficial to evaluate funders in a sense of, do they align with the organization's values on trauma-informed care, voluntary services, and things like that. So that's something to think about. Um, if yes, if you answer yes to some of these questions, we can make some changes and things like that. Or yes, we can't, or no, we can't make changes. How can we make this easier, the easiest way possible for survivors? What are those minute things that we can maneuver around to make it easier to support survivors? If no, things can be changed. Again, thinking about making it easier. Um, how can we assist them and support them? And finally, we have the most importantly, but not least at all, how can we engage the voices of those most impacted here and change it to best support survivors? This is where survivors' input come into handy. This is where that feedback comes into handy. This is where inviting the most impacted to the table to help and provide information to make some of these decisions or make better decisions, is key here. So what I want you to remember is, this is a lot of information, and we're not asking for change to be done all at once. But remember, it takes time, it takes commitment, it takes creativity, it takes collaboration to fully incorporate some of these voluntary services into your program. This is an ever evolving process. Again, like I talked about, having those stages throughout the year where we're evaluating some of these policies and practices that we have in place. So you may be wondering, where do you start or how can you start? There are some key questions as well that you can ask yourself. Um, is anything in our program mandated? Are we requiring survivors to do anything? For example, are survivors required to be sober? Are they required to be drug free? while participating in program services. So start there. Is there anything required or that we're mandating? Um, are survivors given a choice in participating in support services? For example, is a survivor required to meet with their case manager weekly, or do they have a choice how often or how much they want to meet with their case manager? That's something to think about as well. Next, are survivors able to determine how little or how much they want to utilize any support services in your program? Again, given that autonomy, given empowering to make the best decisions for them. For example, a program may offer financial coaching that allows a survivor to determine how little or how much time they want to spend in financial coaching. Um, that's more voluntary service than mandating. You have to, you know, save this much money a month. You have to do this, and we have to, mm, checking over your shoulders and seeing that you're doing all these things. Um, Also, it's important to know that if survivors specifically ask for structure, that is something you can give them. Like if a survivor wants to be in a more structured place for sober living, that's okay to provide that. But mandating it or making people comply and going against the survivor's choice, that's when we fall outside that line of the voluntary services model. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about some benefits of voluntary services approach. Um, so first here at the bottom, we have agency empowerment. And you've heard us talk about this over and over probably on this call, but it is very much vital and key to always make sure survivors are their voices are being heard and they're given a choice in some of the things that they're wanting to participate in. Um, it impacts them. It builds confidence to know that they can make decisions and things like this. So wherever possible, I always tell people, make sure survivors' voices are being heard. They have a voice in what they want to do, and they get a choice in what they want to do or not. Next, we have sustainable approach. So this impacts long-term changes. A voluntary service approach enables survivors to learn skills to choose what's best for them, and what resources they need. And in doing that, they again feel confident, feel more empowered to know that they can make choices for themselves, sometimes after the choice has been removed from them as well. Um, and finally, we have trauma informed and person centered. This gives individuals the power to identify what they want from your organization, not just what you want to provide or not just the services that you're capable of providing, but what they want to receive. They may just want solely housing and nothing else. They may not want to go through counseling. They may not want to participate in any of the other services that you're offering. So this minimizes the power dynamics. This puts them on even keel where they are able to speak for themselves. Their goals are able to be identified by them, and they're able to work on those goals that they see will be most beneficial for them. Person center may be uncomfortable with service providers, but it requires trust that individuals know what's best for them. They truly do. It's easy for someone to follow the standardized approach, but when we become more person-centered, it means that we're more adaptable and able to individualize our services and things that we're offering to survivors as well. Next slide. So some of the misconceptions of voluntary services approach. So what we see often is like voluntary is automatically voluntary services. So basically saying, oh, our program is voluntary. People come here of their own volition, so it's automatically voluntary. So that's not the case at all. Like we talked about, survivors got to have a choice whether or not they want to participate in some of the services, whether they want to participate in, like I talked about, the therapy or the art therapy or the equine therapy you all may offer. Um, just because it's voluntary doesn't mean it's voluntary services. That's key when you go into evaluating some of these practices. Specifically, anything mandated is definitely not voluntary services. Next, we have voluntary services ignore safety concerns. Prioritizing safety does not mean you can't have voluntary services. It's valid and common to think about safety concerns when considering voluntary services, However, voluntary services does not mean safety is not a consideration. Does not mean you cannot have boundaries. Does not mean the program can't have um, those key things that someone may get dismissed or discharged from the program from. So it doesn't mean throw all the boundaries or the rules out of the window as well. Voluntary services won't, next we have voluntary services won't help survivors in the long run. As Darren talked about in some of the studies, it's actually not true. Voluntary services actually will benefit for the larger sense of transparency and agency and empowerment. When survivors feel like they can be open and honest and not to have to hide anything because of rules and regulations, that builds trust, that builds a rapport, that builds a long-term relationship because we want to set survivors up to, maneuver outside of being in the program. So that helps them be more prepared to live life outside of a program. So, it actually does help and benefit survivors, as we talked about with the studies and as we've seen in practice. Next slide. So moving toward a voluntary service approach takes a few things. It takes survivor engagement and feedback, which we talked about. Sometimes as service providers, we tend to think, again, we know what's best, so our strategies are impeccable, but we need to hear back from those who've been most impacted. We need to truly listen to survivors. The feedback can help in creating responsive programs that meet the actual and true needs of survivors. So you'll see we'll be dropping a few survivor engagement resources into the chat for you. Also, if you receive OVC funds for human trafficking, another available resource is survivor engagement training and technical assistance, which is SETA as well. This can help in increasing survivor engagement and forming new relationships with those lived experience experts within your communities. For questions directly related to survivor engagement TTA project, we're going to please email survivor engagement TTA at ICF.com. So those are some of the resources that are available to you when we're talking about survivor engagement and feedback. So as well, moving towards a voluntary service approach takes collaboration with community partners. Somebody may be out there doing it a different way, maybe doing it a better way. Having those conversations with our peers. I know one of the things that you'll see from us and you'll hear from us talk about is our peer learning communities, where we're able to come together and talk to our peers, collaborate on any issues that we're coming up. So having feedback from your community partners and will help as well. And finally, small steps. It takes small steps. We not saying go to the drawing board and erase everything right now. Everything does not have to be done all at once. We can start small. We can start with those. Right now, what do we have mandated? What are we requiring survivors to do? And we can just look at those policy and practices, which is something we'll help you do when we're going through that policy and procedure process, because we do look through a voluntary services lens in that process. Um, so we're going to go to the next slide. Okay, so that leads us into our next session. So we've reviewed a bit about voluntary services. So now we'll be able to see it a bit in practice and we'll be able to hear from you. So we'll be dropping a link to a Google Jamboard for everyone in the chat. So this will require everyone's participation. You're able to participate anonymously as well. So we're just going to look at the knowledge we cover and attempt to review some scenarios through a voluntary services lens. But first, I want to go over the Jamboard instructions. For those of you who may be new to using Jamboards, we have a couple of things here to help you. So here on that toolbar on the left side, you're able to use sticky notes and type those in and be adding those to the Jamboard. You're able to add your comment, hover over different icons to see which option is best. But today we'll be using the sticky icon out here on the left on the toolbar. And you'll be able to maneuver through the Jamboard as well using those arrows at the top when we're talking about different scenarios. Thank you. Again, like I said, you're an anonymous animal here. I see people are coming in to the Jamboard. Great. I'm so glad that you all are going to participate. But you'll be anonymous when you're adding these notes. Be mindful not to delete other stickies as we're maneuvering around in the Jamboard. And we're able to save this later and share with you all as a PDF as well. So next Jamboard slide. So I'll be reading the scenarios, and you are going to type your answers on your sticky, and you're going to place them in the Jamboard. So we have the first scenario coming up. So an organization has a mandatory curfew of 11 p.m. every night. Several survivors have consistently broken curfew for various reasons. How would your current policy and procedure address this? So how does your current policy and procedure address this? And also share with me, how would you shift this scenario, this practice policy into a more voluntary services approach? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to click on this sticky icon on the left-hand side in the toolbar and write your okay. So the first sticky I see here is not applicable. Our housing program is independent scatter site apartments. So that's good. So that doesn't so you all are not requiring curfews, which is good. Survivors are able to live independent scatter site in their own apartments. I see another who said we use scatter site transitional housing without a curfew as well. Okay, if you are already using scatter site or you already don't have curfews in place, what if you had a mandatory curfew in place? How would you be able to shift that policy into a more voluntary services approach? And we have quite a few people here on the Jamboard. So I'm waiting to see your stickies. I'm gonna give you a few more minutes. So right now we are assessing this current scenario. An organization has a mandatory curfew of 11 p.m. every night. Several survivors have consistently broken curfew for various reasons. How would your current policy and procedure address this? Or how can this shift toward a more voluntary service approach happen? So I do see a sticky note here. I see a few sticky notes here. Let me try to zoom in a bit so I can see those. Again, we have a not applicable for my program, but for the sake of the example, I would probably compile information about why people are breaking curfew and how the rule is affecting them. So this is a good story, compiling and gathering that information. Sometimes we have rules in place and we don't, talk to people about how those rules may be affecting them. So this is a good start. So the next one I have here is then consider a modification. Oh, it goes with the first one. So then the person says they will consider a modification if it seems appropriate. Work with clients to create a new rule or eliminate it. So that's collaboration and work, and get, getting engagement from survivors as well, and creating a new rule that may help and alleviate uh, this curfew. This curfew are being broken consistently for various reasons. Okay, so the sticky note I have right now, it says the organization um with curfews could ask residents to call if they will be late. So with this seems a bit like monitoring. So having to notify someone of my locations or if I'm going to be late and things like that seems a bit more towards monitoring, and I would say not as much voluntary services as um not as much empowering as it could be to, not have the curfew because they're able to move around independently. Someone says we do have a curfew. If a client is not coming home at times, then the case manager would check in to see what's going on. Is it transportation issue? Are they using? Okay, again, we want to see how we can move this toward a more voluntary services approach. Part two of that first one I just read, the case manager will problem solve with them. If they need more time, then they could be let us know what time they are coming back to the shelter. Again, why do we want to know what time they're coming back? So why is this a policy in the first place for you all? So another one here I see is ask survivors to give you a time after which they would like you to check in on them, such as if they work late hours, they may want you to check in on them. Again, giving them a choice. I like this. Asking them, would you mind if I call or would you want a call? So, and they have the choice to say whether or not they want to call or not, if they want to be checked on or not, but also removing the policy. Someone says I agree with that. So we had a lot of really good answers and a lot of things were repeated on this one. So we're going to move on to our next scenario. Next slide, next Jamboard slide, please. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for the next one. We have this last one, and then we're going to jump back over into our presentation. So your organization has required weekly check-ins with residents that live independently in rental housing. Some of the survivors have been skipping check-ins. Some have conflicts with work situations, and others do not provide an explanation at all. So how would your current policy and procedure address this? And how can this be shifted toward a voluntary services approach? So we're going to spend a few more minutes on this one, and then we're going to move forward. So again, your organization has required weekly check-ins with the residents that live independently in rental housing. And some of the survivors have been skipping check-ins. Some have conflicts with the work situations, and others do not provide an explanation at all. Let's see what we got down here first. I have to zoom it in for myself. I think the focus should be on relationship, not control, helping survivors understand relational courtesies and healthy communications. That's something to talk about. That's something to think about. Um, I see another one here that says this is dependent on funding requirements. For example, one rental assistance grant requires we document weekly check-ins and requires certain goals be accomplished. Okay, that goes back to when we're evaluating practices and determining what our funder needs, um, and what our funder requires. For example, this one is required. So how are you able to make this easier for survivors? How are you able to transition check-ins from Are check-ins able to be in person? Are they able to be virtual, via phone? How do we make that easier? Y'all are putting down some really good answers. They can see someone said they can be virtual or a phone or in person. So we're giving options here. So that's more voluntary services. So for the sake of time, we're going to jump back over into the PowerPoint. I want to thank everyone who participated in this scenario. This is just a little discussion. This is how you start the discussion around voluntary services and implementing that approach into your programs. I'm going to toss it over to Karen for our next session.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so we're gonna just go ahead and wrap it up with our last section, which is just sharing and discussing some frequently asked questions. So we can go into the next slide. As I'm going into these frequently asked questions, Freedom Network did develop a frequently asked questions fact sheet that will share some of the questions and answers that we often get asked around this type of model, and what are some of the ideas, the approaches that you may want to consider. So the first question that often gets asked is it okay to provide housing and not require individuals to participate in services? If so, how do you achieve self-sufficiency? So yes, definitely it's not only okay, it is encouraged to make that option of providing housing and allowing survivors to participate in the services and give them the options of the programs that you're service through your service provision that you offer. So if you're, providing case management, if you're providing education or job training or therapy, make those known and allow the survivor to gauge and to decide what might feel like a good fit for them at that time. And housing can continue to be just that constant and steady service that they might be receiving from you. You can share and discuss the benefits of participating in some of these programs. You can share what's being covered, when they're available, if it's a group, if it's a class, and allowing that survivor and empowering them with information for them to choose what is best for them. So that allows them to have sufficient information to decide how they would like to move forward. And then discussion and open up that space in case there are any assumptions or biases about how we may be as service providers assuming that because we're already, or because a survivor has been trafficked or experienced trafficking, that they're not already self-sufficient. There again, we are one step and one stop in their journey. They were likely self-sufficient without us, or they were already doing and working things out without us, and they will need to and continue to do that without us. We happen to be in a place and in that touch point where we get to be of support and service to them, and it make hopefully their lives a little bit easier during their interactions with us. Let's go to the next question, the next slide. And this question is around how do we begin implementing a shift to applying a voluntary services approach to the program? So for first things first, this is an organizational wide commitment. It means that as an organization, you need to really be all on the same page from frontline staff. You're going to have your advocates, you're going to have your case managers, those that are supporting survivors directly, to those that are managing the project, to those that are managing the organization, because it does have that type of shift and it needs to have that understanding and buy-in from multiple levels. So it's discussing, what are some of the potential concerns that the organization might have. It doesn't mean that we don't do it because we're worried or scared. It means that we ask the questions and we figure out how can we address these in a way that's going to set us up to best provide voluntary services in that approach to survivors. So discuss any potential points and parts that you may want to start out. An easy way is to look at, or an easy, it's not that it's easy once we do it, it takes work, but it's more so saying an initial start might be your policies and procedures, right? Because oftentimes that technically should be the guiding document that helps us get through, and that as new staff come on that they're reading, that they're using as their guide of how they are to engage and support survivors. So that's a place to start looking at how we're doing intakes. Are we, that's an easy place to screen out survivors. And so we want to make sure that maybe that's a starting point of where we look at, are we screening out survivors unintentionally or sometimes intentionally? So you can start looking at some of those areas, or where you have already gotten a lot of feedback from survivors, whether it's verbal feedback or lack of participation or significant participation. So that's all feedback, and starting at those parts there. We can go to the next slide. The next slide is around, and this comes up probably more often than I would have imagined, is if you already have different funding streams, because we're nonprofits, we need money. OVC provides some money. It would be nice to have more money. And oftentimes we need to supplement with whether it's state money or private money or whatever type of funding that you might be able to get in order to provide services to as many survivors as possible. So if you have other funding that mandates or conflicts with the voluntary services approach, how can you navigate that? So the first thing is really getting a sense about OVC is committed and is investing, obviously through this webinar and through the technical assistance that we provide, to a voluntary services approach. Even within their solicitation, you will see that outlined. Whoever wrote your proposal, they will be familiar with that. And so OVC is very much on board. They want to provide you as a service provider the tools necessary to be able to engage in voluntary services. If there are other programs that you're running that have mandates, I know that some that we've worked with in the past, they've had, for example, they have to do urine samples to ensure that somebody's not using substances because they receive a very specific type of funding that supports individuals who have been trafficked, but also that are experiencing or are using substances. So one way that you can look through that is applying the money through OVC or some of the other options that you have through a scattered site. Scattered site is when you're not the one directly providing the housing, but everyone has more independent rooms or homes or apartments that they're living in. That alleviates a lot of the concerns that we often hear from programs, specifically from their funder, because they want to ensure that the community that is living within that area, and I'm talking about survivors specifically, that they are safe. And so by allowing people to have autonomy and in more individualized spaces, that can be one way to invest. The second way is that you may want to keep those pots separate and have a program that is supported by OVC funding that allows for you to have the scattered site housing. And if you have a different pot of money that has very specific requirements that may have that may be more in alignment with somebody that is solely seeking or really focused on sober living, that may be a better fit. Like Carrie mentioned, somebody and some of the survivors may want that and they might see a benefit to it, and that's great. That if you provide those, you can ensure that they have the separation, so that way you have the option and the opportunity for people to be housed through, especially utilizing your OVC funds in a way that encourages and allows that autonomy. And it's also a really good way for you to start suggesting and educating, quite frankly, funders about what the implications and what some of the outcomes of not providing a voluntary services approach can be, because we imagine that most funders who invest in this type of work want to be good stewards of not just of the money that they're providing, but they want to support you in providing the best services that you can for survivors. And so that's a good education point. In saying, hey, we're curious about this requirement. Can you help us understand is there something that you're seeking? This is what we've seen with survivors of human trafficking and how it can negatively impact them, etc. So that's a really good point of conversation and for you to educate your funder. And also, if that seems like there's not a lot of budging there, to maybe separate those programs. And also being very, very transparent with survivors as soon as possible to allow the survivors the option if your program is a good fit for them. Let them decide that. I know, especially with some programs that serve minors, under the age of 18, oftentimes there might be restrictions that are going to be more different. It doesn't mean we don't give choice. We give choice where we can. And that's, where you have the ability to have transparency. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so we have a few minutes for Q&A. So I want to go ahead and get us started. I know that there was a Q&A in the Q&A box, so we'll go ahead and answer that. And then if there are other questions, please let us know. And do you mind reading the question that we received on the Q&A box?
Absolutely. So we have a question, and there's a couple of questions. So I'll also put it in the chat. Theoretically, how do survivors learn how to make choices that will contribute to their well-being if they receive the same benefits, whether they engage in services or not? How do survivors learn about natural consequences within this model? Once they leave a housing program, they may live somewhere that may have rules that they will have to observe in order to remain.
Thank you, Em. Yeah, this is a good question. Thank you for asking it. I think at the core, it seems like there is this question or desire to ensure that the survivor is able to learn how to make choices. And if we go to a core, we need to acknowledge that survivors have been making choices again before and after our experience with them and our interactions with them. They've had to make those questions. They've had to survive, and they will continue to do that. We have the opportunity to provide a space where survivors are able to make empowered choices. So not choices because they're being forced to at the detriment of their own experience or at the possibility of losing housing, but choices that they can take their self-autonomy, restore their ability to make choices, and to quite frankly advocate for themselves and say, this is what I'm wanting, this is what I'm needing. And we happen to be creating that space and that learning opportunity where when they go or if they go to a different housing program where they may have rules, they have the ability to say that, this is something I'm not interested in for this specific reason, or this part of the program. Is it possible for me to just have housing? And that also allows us to communicate with other partners about ensuring, or hopefully at least educating around having the ability to have them implement a voluntary services approach. But also, it's not, as our role of service providers in housing is to provide housing. And so we won't be everything to everyone, but we do have a unique opportunity to create and open up that space where survivors get to regain that autonomy. I don't know if Shakari, if there's anything that you'd add.
No, I'll just second what you said. Like survivors have been making their own choices. Just because they've experienced trafficking does not mean they're incapable of making their own choices. And to always remember that they can make their own choices. They want to make their own choices. And taking that away from them is involuntary services. Is we want to empower them to use their voice. And this can be moments of relationship building and communication on how one can advocate for themselves. So I just second what you said, Clarice.
Awesome. I think we might have time for one more question if there is anything that people are interested in. Also, we will share our email so that way if something comes up or something that you'd like to discuss more one-on-one or get some brainstorming around, we are definitely happy to do that. And then Emma, if you see more questions, feel free to, or a question, feel free to read it out.
Yeah. Yeah, we have something in the chat. So it's stating we had a situation where a survivor started bringing in men into the home and we were paying for them to solicit. What is your suggestion to that situation?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good and very tricky question because I think hopefully I'm understanding that scenario correctly. But what we've heard from programs is at times there is a fear that survivors who are being supported in, especially when it's a shared facility, whether it's shared rooms or a shelter, where they're going to recruit, if you will, for other survivors who are engaged in that program, or they're recruiting those survivors. I think specifically if you have, I don't know if this is a shared community setting or if it's individualized programs. I think that's a little bit more of the situation that you'd want to assess, because it is going to be a little bit of a different response if you have somebody that's in their own apartment than somebody that is in a communal setting. So, okay, so you're paying rent for their apartment. Okay, so here's a question, and this I think might be a offline conversation just because I'm looking at the time. I think, yeah, with one thing that I'm seeing is that this might be suggesting that the survivor is engaging in sex work, which at that point, if they are in their own individual apartment, we want to ensure that survivors are not being excluded from services or kicked out if they are adults and if they're engaging in sex work out of choice circumstance or whatnot, regardless of what, however we might personally feel about them. We know that survivors can and have and will continue to engage in sex work. And that's one of the areas that we've clarified with OVC because there have been questions throughout the years around how do you work with survivors that may be engaging in sex work as work, as a choice, where the program may feel one way about it, or it might be a personal, feeling. And also being aware, and I think somebody just posted on the chat, how do we know that that's what they're doing, right? Is this something that we're receiving reports on, which I hope we're not? Are there other survivors who are reporting on this survivor that's being assumed to be engaging in these activities? Because what you want to be cautious of is we don't want survivors to feel like they have to be vigilantes or looking into each other and reporting on each other. That creates a dynamic that's not as helpful. But I will pause there. I will definitely suggest reaching out to us and then we would love to have more conversation to ensure that we have, that we're able to understand and also get some more useful feedback to you. So I'm going to pause there and then I'm going to send it back to Shakari, who's going to wrap us up.
Okay, so we're moving on to our next steps. Next slide. So after everything we covered today, we encourage you to reflect and identify any areas of strength and potential areas of growth. So that's something to sit down with your staff, sit down and see where can we make improvements? Where can we grow? Another thing for our FY 2023 grantees, you'll be participating in policy and procedure review process with Freedom Network's Housing TTA project. So OVC will be issuing directives via email when grantees are to submit their P&P documents to us, their policy and procedure documents to Freedom Network. So engaging in that and participating in that, because we will be looking through this process through a voluntary services approach. So next, you can engage in additional training and technical assistance and support. We'll be dropping links to our resource library, specifically those tagged for voluntary services. And you can review those resources around voluntary services approach and let us know if you have any questions, and we will be able to help you. Next slide. So another resource we have coming up here is our peer learning community call. So the topic will be based on policy and procedure review, and that call will be taking place on March 28, 2024. We will have an email invitation to follow up where you'll be able to talk with other peers and collaborate with other grantees and to discuss challenges and share ideas with those who are doing similar work. Next slide. So this wraps it up for us today. So we are giving you our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us. Again, reminder, OVC will be issuing directives via email when grantees are to submit their policy and procedure documents. But we do want to encourage you, like I said, to visit our resource library for more resources. We do have a voluntary services frequently asked questions document that will be a good additional resource to look at as well. If you would like to receive a certificate of completion for this webinar, please reach out to us at housing@freedomnetworkusa.org, which we'll be dropping that in the chat as well. We are so glad that you were with us today. Next slide. And we want to thank you all for participating and being here today. And we want to thank Darren, our other presenter, and we also want to thank our other Freedom Network staff that helped us facilitate this as well. So wish you all a good rest of the day for your Thursday. And we'll be in touch, and feel free to reach out to us as well. Thank you. And also, before you jump off, we do have a survey that we appreciate your feedback on. So we're dropping it in the chat. We love to make improvements on things that we're doing around here at Freedom Network Training Institute. So feel free to complete that survey.